think we're going. So hi everyone. I just want to first say thanks to all the panelists for the work they've put into this, all the audience for coming, and of course the MSA for sort of supporting and running this session. So my name's Heather Proctor. I'm a recently completed PhD candidate at Newcastle, and I specialise in racial subjectivities and legacies colonialism. And sort of aside from that, I work on projects around sort of EDI, anti-racism and decolonisation. And our panelists today I will introduce just before they speak, but we have Professor Annie Tindley, Dr. Luz Velpos, Jemima Kimbula, and Dr. Samantha Travis. And we also have Mohammed Topdash, but unfortunately for technical reasons can't speak today, but has contributed to sort of what we're going to be presenting. So just a quick note on housekeeping. To avoid disruptions during the presentations, all the audience microphones and cameras will be disabled until the Q&A. Once we reach the Q&A, you'll be able to unmute and activate your cameras if you'd like to ask a question, and you can use the raise hand feature in Teams in order to do that. The chat feature is disabled, but you can also submit questions and comments using the Q&A chat as well. So you don't have to sort of come in on camera if you don't want to. And just a note to everyone that the session is recorded as well. So this roundtable discussion will be about the ongoing work into the colonial history of Newcastle University and the broader implications that this particular case study has for how colonialism is remembered and apprehended in both educational contexts and in the context of England, or maybe more specifically North East England. So here I'll stop and pass to Annie and quickly sort of introduce her. So Annie Tindley is a professor of British and Irish rural history and the head of the School of History, Classics and Archaeology at Newcastle. She researches and publishes on history and contemporary legacies of land and environmental issues, including land ownership, land reform, land use and management. And she's also chair of Newcastle University's Black History Month steering group. So Annie, I'll pass to you.
Thank you so much, Heather, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and a huge thanks to the team for hosting us today, and thanks for your kind introduction, Heather. I'm kicking off the panel comments today, I suppose really to give some historical context around the specifics and the specific experiences and histories of Newcastle University and the northeast of England. And as such, I've got a few slides to share because I have some kind of historical text and images. So if folk could just bear with me for one moment while I load that up, I'd be very grateful. Let me just get this to slideshow. Okay. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Okay, so as I said, I want to give a bit of an introduction to the specifics of the history that we're grappling with at Newcastle University, because of course each institution, higher education institution and other institutions that starts to undertake this work has to look at the specifics of the kinds of imperial entanglements that their institutions were involved in, and also in a way to inform in a more kind of considered way how to untangle or work through the contemporary legacies and sort of future steps around that. So I'm going to give a bit of an introduction to us here at Newcastle University. Newcastle University as it is today is a relatively young institution, created in 1963. It had been one of the colleges, or two of the colleges of Durham University before then. As you can see there, the School of Medicine and Surgery and the College of Physical Science, sort of effectively engineering, really. And the reason why those two colleges had been established by Durham and Newcastle is because by the early 19th century, Newcastle was a growing, well, really one of the leading hubs of the Industrial Revolution in England and Britain overall. And the Town Council of Newcastle was very active in promoting the interests of the city and keen to establish it as a site for useful knowledge and training in the kind of new developing industries and, of course, the developing British Empire as well. So as you see there, the colleges were established in the 1830s and then the 1870s and remained under the sort of governance, as it were, of Durham University until an Act of Parliament established it as a separate university in 1963 as part of a wave of a creation of new universities around that time. As I mentioned there then, the Town Council and Durham University's leadership worked very hard to raise the funds in order to establish these colleges. So that included, of course, the staffing and attracting expertise and academic expertise into these colleges, but also developing the physical fabric of the colleges as well, looking for bespoke buildings to house the expansion of the colleges. And the kind of focus of our work has really been around what we now call the Armstrong Building. I'll come back to Armstrong in a minute, and which was built in three parts. It's a kind of a triangle building, and the university and town council worked pretty hard and to raise the funds to build these in three separate parts. So they began a kind of fundraising campaign for the College of Physical Science, specifically, so that this is less to do with the medical school, but more to do with the physical science or engineering departments. And as uncovered by two PhD students in our School of Maths, Stats and Physics, who were undertaking research into the history of what is now the faculty, they uncovered a receipt of a donation from King Leopold II of the Belgians, who'd been approached on behalf of the university by the Belgian consul, George Reed. That donation was made out specifically to what was being called the Stephenson Engineering Department, named after George Stephenson, even in the later 19th century, a famous railway engineer and kind of, I suppose, pioneer in the Industrial Revolution from the Northeast. So they'd already kind of taken the Stephenson name to promote fundraising for this new department. The total eventual cost of that building, which is now one arm, as it were, of the Armstrong Building, was £75,000, of which, as we say, £500 came from King Leopold II. This actually followed a much earlier request in the 1870s from the Town Council, who had approached King Leopold II earlier for a similar donation, but in that case to fund centenary celebrations of George Stephenson's birth, which the city was planning to mark with a range of events and kind of commemorative activities. When the town mayor approached King Leopold II in that case, he referenced the fact that George Stephenson had been instrumental in designing the domestic railways of Belgium under King Leopold II's father, Leopold I. So in that case, King Leopold II had promised this £500. The town council had never followed up. There was in fact no celebrations around Stephenson's centenary. But when the university and the town were raising money to build this new college, they obviously remembered the fact that Leopold II had offered this money and approached him again and successfully secured it for him for the purposes of this building. The donation was obviously very gratefully received because the college assiduously followed up with King Leopold II. They invited him to open the building, which event was 1895. They invited him to join Convocation, which is one of the governing bodies of the university, principally made up by alumni, but obviously at this period also donors and supporters. And they also offered King Leopold II an honorary degree. He declined all three of these offers, and also a suggestion that the building might be named after him. The Armstrong Building is in fact named after Lord William Armstrong, a kind of a business owner, an engineer, who established Armstrong Vickers, the munitions and arms manufacturer and dealer, which was one of the largest employers in Newcastle at the time, and sold arms and armaments across not just the empire, but across the world. Lord William Armstrong was a key figure in city politics and regional politics, and so the building is actually named after him. However, King Leopold II, as I say, refused the invitation to come and open the Armstrong Building. So instead, the mayor of Newcastle opened it and made extensive reference to King Leopold throughout his opening speech. These are the opening paragraphs of his speech that he gave on the day. I've highlighted the key kind of phrases there that reference King Leopold, who's described here as someone who has earned the gratitude of all friends of the college, that His Majesty was amongst the first and most liberal donors to this new building. And although you see here referenced as not only one of the most enlightened sovereigns in Europe, but unfortunately for us, he is also one of the most hard worked. So as we know, as many of us will know, I think, King Leopold II was a very busy man. And that was principally because he was focused and working on the setup and administration of his private fiefdom in what was then called the Belgian Congo, and included kind of enormous rubber extraction run by a kind of private police force, a private army, essentially, and under which kind of a wide range of kind of absolute atrocities took place, including summary executions, forced labor and slavery, mutilations, and more. When Newcastle University was kind of trying to make and then extend contacts with King Leopold II, there was widespread concern in Europe about his activities in the Belgian Congo. They were fully exposed in the Casement report just after the turn of the 20th century, so just after this period. But there's no doubt, I think, that information about what was happening in the Belgian Congo was widely known and must have been known to the town council in Newcastle and the administration in Durham University and Newcastle College. So it was this donation and the kind of complex and difficult questions it raised about institutional entanglements with empire, a specific aspect of empire that we have been working on together really over the past few years within Newcastle University. The questions we wanted to ask were these, although there are more, and we will unpack those questions today with you, and be great to know your questions about this particular history as well. So the first thing we needed to understand was how and why the donation was made and accepted, to really bottom out the archival research around that and to build in as much of the historical context as we could. And really, what does it mean for our university, our staff and our students, but also the wider public in the city and the region, and of course, internationally. We also wanted to learn as much as we could from other institutions, I mean higher education institutions specifically here, facing similar legacies, and support that wider ethical conversation on reparative action. And we're very grateful specifically to colleagues from the universities of Glasgow and Edinburgh who shared their expertise and experiences with us as part of this work. And then the sort of last question, probably the most important, really, which is, what do we do with this legacy, with this history? How can it inform our thinking as a university community, our strategic objectives in a difficult climate, and so sort of especially I think in relation to our community of international staff and students. So being open and acknowledging this aspect of our history. Essentially, this history is in the university's DNA, but then working towards maybe a different kind of future. And this is my last slide. And this was our original set of outcomes that we wanted to make from the project. We wanted to have this history fully visible and embedded in the strategic documents of the university, not just in the documents, but in its approach, its ways of working, how the university can ethically navigate its global engagement activities, whether that's student recruitment or research, or whatever it might be. And to do that, we wanted to make sure we had a set of resources co-designed with city partners and regional partners across staff and students, so that were easily and fully accessible to all, so that historical understanding was clear. And we really wanted to expand the research on this much more broadly. So this particular history focuses on one donation made by King Leopold II. But of course, the university's imperial entanglements were much wider, from the degree programs that were taught and researched and prioritised, through to where our graduates went on to work after graduation, typically across the empire, or supporting industries that had major imperial markets. Newcastle as a city and the region was one of the first industrial regions globally, really, and its success was completely dependent on the imperial opportunities that were accessible to it. So the research needs to continue as well into that broader context. That's the end of my kind of brief summary of the history. I'm happy to take any further questions on context, etc. In the Q&A, but hopefully that lays out where we are in terms of the historical research into this area. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Heather.
Thanks so much, Annie. That was really great. So now I'll pass to Luce. So Luce is a senior lecturer in architecture and urban planning at Newcastle and has a background in architectural design, urban history, urban planning and heritage studies. So her research focuses on the political and socio-ethical nature of buildings, in particular the context of practices we label as heritage, and particularly from the perspective of care. So Luce.
Thank you, Heather. No slides for me, so I'm just gonna talk at you. I hope that's okay. Because yeah, now we know all this. You know, what is the context, the history. I think it's also important to have a brief reflection on, let's say, the reality of doing this kind of work in a university, and kind of, yeah, making sure it gets embedded. The points that Annie raised at the end of her presentation, I think, are really important, but also, as I'm sure many of you are aware, not very easy to achieve. As in many institutions, this project or projects like this, the Campus Legacies project, as we call it, we developed, we started to address the history, and this is kind of the colonial histories, and this is of course appreciated by many of our colleagues, but it also reveals where the unwillingness lies, let's say, to acknowledge, and the uncomfortableness with this work in some other places of the university. So the PGR students Annie referred to that found a document referring to the contribution of Leopold II. They did that in 2021. So we are now 4 years later, and a lot of pushing and pulling later also, I would say. And we've had like several meetings, workshops. We have produced reports on the history and of the impact, which is what we are talking about today, of course. There is a web page, there is a campus walk now. But all of that is kind of bottom-up work. None of that was commissioned by or asked for by the university, if you think of the university as not all of us, but maybe senior management. Yeah, it's of course, we all know this as kind of heritage and memory scholars. It's convenient to remember, to commemorate. For example, the honorary degree that we gave to Martin Luther King in 1976. And a whole statue was erected for this in 2017, and rightly so, of course. Albeit maybe a bit ironic that this statue for a man who highlighted the three problems in the world as racism, poverty, and war stands in front of a building that is named after Lord Armstrong, who was not just an arms dealer, as Annie already referred to, but also broke local strikes, and definitely was not alleviating poverty. But as it's convenient to remember certain people, it is also convenient to forget certain people. And it is definitely convenient for the university to forget the donation by this genocidal King Leopold II. And so, yeah, to kind of think about what this means, I wanted to actually start with what some others have already said about this. Of course, there are many others who have spoken and written about the work that goes into what we may call decolonizing the university. And the many ways that work is hindered or willfully misunderstood by I mean, the university is multiple, right? By the university as much as by not the university. So I would like to read this quote from the introduction to the 2018 book by Bambra, Gabriel, and Nisanjol, which is called Decolonizing the University, ? Because it sets the context for decolonizing universities rather well. The quote starts, taking colonialism as a global project as a starting point, it becomes difficult to turn away from the Western university as the key site through which colonialism and the colonial knowledge in particular is produced, consecrated, institutionalized, and naturalized. It was in the university that the colonial intellectuals developed theories of racism, popularized discourses that bolstered support for colonial endeavors, and provided ethical and intellectual grounds for the dispossession, oppression, and domination of colonized subjects. In the colonial metropolis, universities provided would-be colonial administrators with knowledge of the peoples they would rule over, as well as lessons in techniques of domination and exploitation. The foundation of European higher education institutions in colonized territories itself became an infrastructure of empire. An institution and actor through which the totalizing logic of domination could be extended. European forms of knowledge were spread, local indigenous knowledge suppressed, and native informants trained. In both colony and metropole, universities were founded and financed through the spoils of colonial plunder, enslavement, and dispossessions. End quote. So I think, yeah, to kind of set the context for the discussion today, I think it's really important to kind of keep in mind the university itself, of course, being a big ground for colonial endeavors. And yeah, here we are, you know, like discussing the contributions of this, one of the most maybe genocidal leaders in history to the building of this university. And it's maybe not a huge contribution when it comes to finances, right? It's £500 in the context of like 75,000 for just one part of the building. But that doesn't mean it's not a huge deal that this campus that I'm speaking from right now was co-funded by King Leopold II, and that our mayor, the mayor of the metropole, I don't know, the mayor of this city, as well as the leader of the college here in Newcastle, were interested in getting this person involved with the university. And I guess we can be strangely thankful that his lack of interest means he's not now an honorary degree holder of our university. Of course, the main aim, of the kind of work we've been doing is to decolonize, whilst also recognizing that there may not be a way to truly decolonize a university, as the quote I just read already alludes to. But highlighting these historic links and bringing to the fore their very problematic nature and trying to work towards some form of rectification, restitution, some form of justice is really important. And you would think in many ways a kind of low bar, because you would want to deal with those histories. But we are struggling to get our university management to acknowledge this work, and let alone make a serious investment towards the kind of steps we are proposing through the research that Annie ended with. Yeah, so I guess universities generally don't really want to deal with this. Some universities have been, of course, more than others. And sometimes there is a willingness, but there is not really a priority. And at best, I guess our work is often seen as a worthy ideological endeavor, but then also understood as pretty much impossible, because somehow the question then becomes, how could we possibly sever our links to this brutal regime in the past, or to these brutal regimes in the past and the present? And you would think this is not something we would need to ask, because how could we not sever those links, right? But yet there is no serious move made to break our relations with King Leopold II or with Lord Armstrong, for example. And indeed, we still have partnerships with companies like Leonardo. We put our money in banks like Barclays. So all of these organizations, all these companies, all these links, also in the present have, for example, like the Leonardo and Barclays have links to weapons production that is currently used in Gaza. So if we want to see a different world, if we want to see a different university, we have to build it. And as heritage and memory scholars, we know this. We know that we are making possible and impossible certain futures by the way we remember and by the way we forget. So what do we keep? What do we ignore? What do we promote? As a kind of, small part of the project, or next step in the project that we have been trying to do, is making visible, which is, I think, a really important part, of course. So recently with African Lives in Northern England, we have developed a campus walk to incorporate some of the recent research that Annie kind of presented around the Armstrong building, but also other stories about Black history on campus and around campus that are, that need public discussion, public reflection. In this way, we try to address at least a variety of important but often ignored and concealed materials that may be a step to contribute to Newcastle University's journey towards a greater social history. Once the chat is enabled, I will post a link to the walk in the chat, so you can download the PDF if you're interested. And then just to finish maybe with also with Bambra et al., as they already said in 2018, and as many have kind of discussed, the fall of formal empires did little to change the logic of Western universities. Calls around decolonizing the university have shown how the content of university knowledge remains principally governed by the West for the West. Products of university research are still strategically deployed in the pursuit of imperial projects conducted by Western states and firms in former colonies. And these imperial projects, past and new, remain central to the financing of higher education in the West. Post-colonial scholars and anti-racist activists have made significant strides in bringing these issues to the fore. However, the foundations of the university remain unshakably colonial, and as ever, there is more work to be done. I would say one thing is clear: we cannot conveniently forget the donation by this King Leopold II, I would say a genocidal king, and we have to find ways to deal with it, and there will be multiple ways that we will have to deal with it. And I think Jemima will talk a little bit more about how we could do that.
Thanks so much, Reese. Pass to Jemima. So Jemima Kingula is a recent graduate from both an LLB and LLM. She's worked on projects with the university around campus legacies, EDI, and decolonisation. And her dissertation was on navigating justice, the role of international law in the DRC. And outside of academia, she will be starting her studies to become a solicitor. So Jemima, over to you.
Thank you, Emma. I always have to remember to like unmute as well. So as part of our also wanted to sort of explore what other universities were doing and how, not necessarily how we could copy them, but sort of what could we take from them and sort of adopt in our own project and how we're navigating it. I think one thing to note is every university is different with their own historical background and how they've sort of responded to that. But it was still an opportunity to sort of, learn and just be like, oh, okay, this university did this, how, maybe we would do this. So for the purposes of this session today, I'm going to be focusing on Durham University and Bristol University, only because I found that there was they have different approaches in how they sort of will approach their own historical backgrounds, and then sort of I'll bring in Newcastle and how we've compared it to. So yeah, with Durham University, in terms of their colonial past, it had ties with colonial colleges in Fora Bay College in Sierra Leone and Codrington College in Barbados. And it encouraged Anglican white education. The church also owned sugar plantations and received compensation from their slave owners. So in response to sort of their colonial history, Durham in 2022, following their Bronze Award from the Race Equality Charter, they undertook 2 projects to explore their history. The legacies of enslavement and colonialism at Durham University. And it had the aims to sort of explore the university's institutional archives in order to enhance and understand any potential involvement with colonialism and historical slavery, or any income derived from the historical slavery. More recently, Durham has hosted a week of events honouring Black History Month and reparative justice, which included a tour walking tour, film screening and different workshops as well. I found when doing my research with Durham, they discussed reparative justice in response to mainly like their projects. So it was the projects that they had, and then sort of stemming from those projects, they then just began the discussions around reparative justice and their historical backgrounds. In comparison to when I outlined Bristol University, it was sort of a university led. I'm definitely sure that individuals would have sort of taken the chance to be like, okay, I think we need to explore this. But with Bristol University and Durham's, their approach was very different. With Bristol University, they openly acknowledged, they openly acknowledged their complex links to the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved African people. So one thing I found when doing my research was that when I was trying to find what Durham was doing, it was a lot more difficult in comparison to when I was trying to find what Bristol was doing. They openly had it in like their website, and you can tell that it was a university that understood its historical past and was therefore like, okay, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it. As a long-term plan, Bristol University have started a reparative futures program, And it aims through a series of targeted initiatives to redress some of the systemic injustices arising from African chattel enslavement, sorry. This program is also combined with the university's institutional commitment to anti-racism, and through the work of the anti-racism working groups, it will serve as like a basis for their own ongoing efforts to dismantle all forms of racism. Um, Another thing I found with Bristol is beyond the university itself, Bristol City Council also acknowledged the major role that they have played in Africans being trafficked to the Caribbean and America. Whereas with Durham University, the city council weren't as open, like there's not much of a connection between the two. Um, I think the key takeaways from researching this different institutions was number one, the importance of our project going beyond, okay, this is what we found, what are we going to do with this information and how are we going to navigate it. I think a starting point and the fact that we have started is important, but it was then how we're going to deepen that part of research and go further. With Durham University, one of the good things is that they have recognized a little piece of their history, and then we're like, okay, we're going to do this as part of a project, in comparison to Bristol University, because they've had the support from the university themselves. Their approach was much easier and sort of just, okay, this is what we're going to do, and it's going to be open and clear, and it's not going to be as hidden, I would like to say, as I want to say Newcastle has sort of approached it. And another thing that we started to think about as well is our sort of links with the city council, and how this discussion goes further than just, okay, this just affects the university. It doesn't. Like, the Armstrong building is very much like a part of Newcastle, and it's open not just to students and members who work at the university. Like, it affects much more people than just, us. And so I think one thing that I when I realized in researching these universities was how the city council played such a major role, and with the backing of the city council, it made their projects a lot easier to sort of go through, and it made it a smoother sort of transition. Their hurdles and their like blocks and obstacles weren't as evident as, for example, other universities like us and Durham, where it's not as open and clearly stated. So yeah, I think in finally just bringing it back and comparing it to Newcastle, our new project is definitely there, and we've been able to work on it, and that's great, but it's not been as openly supportive as we would have liked it to be. And I think, as Lois commented, there was no like willingness and priority in comparison to, like, when I looked at some of these other universities, I was like, oh my gosh, this is great. They're doing this and they're doing that. I think even at some point, one of the universities had like 10 million sort of invested in one of their projects, and it was just great. And it was, I think, having your university sort of back the project and the city council back the project was such a key factor that I think I sort of undermined at first, and then through the research I was like, oh my gosh, this is great, like this is what we would like. So I think in terms of researching different institutions, one thing that we realized is our discussions go much further than just us as a university. It affects the local community, and sort of it would be ideal to sort of get that support from the university at some point, whether it's now, whether it's later, because I guarantee, for Bristol, it wouldn't have just been a thing of, okay, we're going to sit down and this is going to be a thing, we're going to do this. They would have had work, and this is, again, been going on like since 2022, I'm going to say. So there's a process to this, and I think just patience and just keeping going will be a major part of our research. So yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jemima. So finally, I'll pass to Samantha. So Samantha holds a PhD from Newcastle, which addressed museal representations of communist history, national identity, and visitor engagement to museum, with a focus on Museum of Communism in Prague and Museum of Life Under Communism in Warsaw. So she currently works as the Research and Innovation Associate on the Knowledge Exchange for Slow Hope project at Nottingham Trent University, as well as the Research Dissemination Officer at the Royal Armouries UK. So over to you, Samantha.
Thank you. So the first thing I want to say is that the first thing I will be saying is actually not my own words. This was put together by Dr. Mohammed Toptash, who is here with us today, but for technical reasons, won't be able to speak. So instead of taking credit for his work, I will just say that the first part of what I'm going to say is entirely written by him. And then maybe I won't tell you what I've written, so Mohammed can get all the credit. Yeah, so the aim for this first part is to reflect on what it means for one of our new buildings at Newcastle University to be partially funded by wealth derived from colonial violence, and to do so through the words and experiences of international students. Their voices emerged through a series of focus group discussions that were carried out by Mohammed, myself, and Heather. I think it was in June 2023. Was it 23 or 24 at this point? I can't remember. As Luce indicated, this project has been going on for a long time through no fault of our own. And so during this, we chose to speak to students who identified as racially minoritized, and what ultimately ended up coming out of that was that a lot of these students almost all of them actually were international students. Why I don't believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Heather, home students did not register for this focus group, but we thought that was an interesting find in and of itself. And so these focus group discussions provided insights for a crucial anchor in how the university might collectively understand the responsibilities that we hold as active users. And so what I'm about to read brings together their reflections, not as a raw testimony, but as carefully considered evidence. Their words help us to see how historical violence, which has been described by Annie, Jemima, and Luce, continues to shape contemporary university life, and how institutional practices can reproduce colonial logics in everyday ways. So a lot of the students that we spoke to described the moment that they learned about the building's origins as a jarring moment of recognition. For some, it was shocking, but for others, it was very deeply unsettling. For example, one student expressed quite plainly, "It made me realize how colonialism is even more, it now has a material base for me." And this realization does matter. In academic spaces, colonialism is often framed as something that exists at a distance, in archives and historical narratives, in theoretical texts. But the building itself made that history feel more immediate and tangible in the present, and the students started to feel this. I should say that we also held the focus groups inside the building. And when I say building, I do mean the Armstrong building specifically. Another student from the Philippines articulated the magnitude of this realization when they said, "They have so much and we don't even have enough chairs. When you learn where these things come from taking from others, I'm less amazed, I'm more horrified." And these reactions were not simply emotional responses. They were analytical ones. They were evidence of students making connections between the material conditions surrounding them and the long histories that made these conditions possible. What disturbed students even more than the colonial origin itself was the silence surrounding it. There was a real sense that not telling the story was itself a form of harm. As we have discussed already today, this knowledge was hidden essentially in archives, and then, if not actively, then implicitly blocked by the university. And so the students saw this again as a form of harm. One student said, "I didn't know it was hidden. That's what makes it suspicious." Another added, "If you do that, you're hiding things. You're not being honest." It is obvious from these statements that omission wasn't neutral. It suggested a decision. This is a decision to avoid discomfort, to protect institutional reputation, or perhaps to preserve a narrative of innocence. But silence, as many pointed out, is an extension of the very erasures that colonialism relied upon, erasures of suffering, of accountability, and of complicity. As one student noted in relation to the idea of renaming the building, changing the name erases the memory and the complicity. To give a bit of background context to that particular quote, in the summer of 2020, at the height of the BLM protests, Newcastle University ran a poll asking staff and students if they would like to change the name of the Armstrong building, given William Armstrong's links to selling arms to the Confederacy during the Civil War, potentially other reasons as well. Ultimately, this was voted against, and the building name remains. But this reveals something very significant. Confronting a colonial history is not simply about identifying wrongdoing. It is about refusing erasure, even when erasure appears easier and more elegant. And many participants highlighted a notion that we in academia know well, that we rarely sit with fully. Colonialism is not a historical residue, it is an ongoing structure. One student had said, it wasn't the past, you have to make something to amend that. People are still affected by it. Another described how the consequences of colonialism live on through contemporary systems. Every aspect of my life as an immigrant here is affected by these things that happened in the past, and that exists in the present. This recognition pushes us beyond symbolic or tokenistic engagement with colonial histories. It reminds us that immigration policy, global inequalities in research infrastructure, tuition fee disparities, and even the language expectations placed on scholars from the global south or the third world or others are not separate issues. They are connected by a shared genealogy. As one participant summarized, colonialism has just changed forms. One of them, I think they have turned into education. They have turned education into an industry. And in this regard, a lot of the students that we spoke to noted their presence within the university is shaped through economic frameworks that feel extractive. They repeatedly return to this idea of being valued more for their revenue than for their scholarly contribution. And to provide also a little bit of context to that, for those who are not based in the UK listening to us today, the international students at least English universities, I can't speak to the other countries, we're regularly charged roughly 3 times what home students are charged for the same education. And so a lot of these students see this as, are they just here for the revenue that they provide, or are they actually valued as members of this academic community? And again, one student said international students are actually just a source of funding. Another said, I don't want to be seen as a source of funding because I'm a person. And these statements weren't made lightly. They emerged from lived experiences, from visa struggles, barriers to teaching opportunities, financial stress, and interpersonal encounters where linguistic or cultural differences became grounds for deficit-based assumptions. One doctoral student described being denied teaching opportunities even because English wasn't their first language, despite meeting every other academic requirement. No PGR with English. PGR is a postgraduate research student. No PGR with English as a second language can be a TA, they said. For some participants, constantly being labeled international created a sense of distance from the broader student community. And for those students, this terminology isn't benign. It marks them as peripheral, as conditional, as legible only through economic or administrative categories. It reinscribes the very hierarchies we often claim to challenge. And another reoccurring theme was the tension between institutional rhetoric and lived reality. Students observed that universities, like many Western institutions, curate narratives of inclusion and equality that do not always match their practices. One student captured this when they said, the West has always been pretentious. We're inclusive. We're not racist. You are. You just admitted it, even in the smallest stuff. In other words, students are watching. They questioned whether the university's public commitment to inclusion, diversity, and historical accountability translate into meaningful change. Their comments suggested a sensitivity to symbolic gestures perceived as superficial or disconnected from substantive institutional action. And students expressed significant reservations about renaming the building. Again, this was attempted in 2020. Their concerns were not rooted in nostalgia or a resistance to change. They were grounded in a desire for genuine accountability. If you change the name, you're hiding more, one of them said. And another suggested a visible and permanent educational intervention. Put up a massive block outside the building, make it really clear. This indicates the desire for the university to reckon with history rather than conceal it, to create spaces where difficult knowledge is present, contextualized, and impossible to ignore. Perhaps the most forceful theme was that decolonial work must be manifest in material commitments. Students pointed out that symbolic gestures like renaming, statements, branding, they're insufficient. One of them said, create opportunities, say that you're sorry, say that you're embarrassed, do something. Decolonization is not a gesture, it's a redistribution of resources, attention, and responsibility. And students also spoke about how colonial legacies shaped their daily experiences within the university. These were subtle, persistent, and often painful moments. One of them described the burden of a stereotype. It affects the way you think, the way you carry yourself. You don't want to fit the stereotype. Another question whether their achievements were genuinely recognized. Am I here because it's of my own merit, or am I here because I'm filling an EDI quota? These questions and the kind that lodge themselves into the everyday consciousness of the students navigating institutions not originally built with them in mind. So to conclude Mohammed's part of this, and then I will say something myself, I want to return to one of the most striking reflections of the focus groups, and it's when someone said, if you don't have any sincere actions, then you'll just be like blah, 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 blah. It's a simple sentence, yet it contains a profound truth. Decolonization cannot be achieved through language alone. It requires us to confront the histories embedded in buildings, in curricula, in recruitment practices, and in assumptions about who belongs in academic spaces. And it requires material commitments that redistribute resources, recognize ongoing inequalities, and create pathways for justice. The participants are telling us generously, bravely, what they see. And what they see is not only contradiction, but possibility. And taken together, the students' reflections outline a roadmap for ethical institutional leadership. They have transparency, accountability, redistribution, collaboration, structural change, and consistency. And in the end, decolonial work is not about the past, it is about the future we are willing to build. So with that in mind, I'll try to say something nearly as elegant. And I have, for myself, I'm going to kind of conclude, well, Heather will do the proper conclusion, but I'll try and conclude a little bit of what this group has talked about today. And that I want to offer a few reflections on the topic as a whole, but more specifically what the importance of this historical donation might mean in the present day. This has been touched upon by the others in various ways, but where I'd like to break from them, perhaps a bit provocatively, is to question whether Newcastle University's colonial past really matters. But let me explain what I mean by that. So as Mohammed had already stated, colonialism is not historical residue, it's an ongoing structure. And we can see that at this particular moment in UK higher education. At the risk of oversimplifying an undoubtedly complex situation, for those who, again, are not based in the UK and are not aware of what's happening in the UK in the moment, I will briefly say that UK universities are currently in a deep financial crisis. Their income is increasingly diminishing, which has had knock-on effects within teaching, research, and student enrollment. And it's very important to understand that amidst this crisis, because international students have come to play a critical role in propping the universities up. As I mentioned, we're charged, again, I think the numbers are rough, but we can say it's about 2.5 to 3 times more than home students. And so when home student tuition fees, which have a legal cap, are not rising, that means that the cost of running a university is not being met with funding, but including that home student fees. So this is where international student fees are able to come in. There is no legal ceiling on how much this group, at least in England, is allowed to be charged in students' fees. So universities have come to rely on their enrollment as a key source of revenue. And despite warnings that the international student bubble will eventually burst, and it has started to do that, universities have nonetheless bet very heavily on their continued presence. They've opened up branch campus in several countries. Current drive seems to be East and South Asia, and it's all usually under the guise of going global. Newcastle is specifically, its motto is from Newcastle for the world. So everything that we do, is meant to be given out back to the world. But they've also used a lot of this funding to invest heavily in university building projects, benefiting from that increased income. And so where this comes in, as we saw in some of those focus group responses, that they start to question, am I here because of my own merit, or am I here to help you build that shiny new building over there because my fees are able to provide that for you? And so it becomes this really big source of tension at the university, at the university level. And again, this bubble, this international student bubble, has started to burst. Numbers are currently down. If anybody in the UK was excited by the budget on Wednesday, you will have seen numbers are one of the things that was also put out beside that is net migration numbers, and net migration, including that includes student visas, are way down, which is putting more pressure on universities, which in turn puts more pressure, likely we will see on international students. And for that, I want to return to one of what the focus group participants noted is that education has been turned into an industry. In an already punishing immigration system, these students are treated like cash cows. We're made to pay triple the fees in comparison to home students, but without any accompanying duty of care upon arrival. An overwhelming sense that they were being taken advantage of came through when we spoke to the students in these focus groups. And this is where I'd like to shift our attention, because we have to interrogate the ways in which the colonial past of a university like Newcastle intersects with what these students described as a new kind of colonialism in the form of this deeply flawed and short-sighted financial model in which resources, in this case, vast amounts of student fees, are taken from largely, though not exclusively, students from the global south to prop up UK universities. Do these actions risk endangering all of what we've been talking about here today, about reparation, about recognizing our history and recognizing what and trying to find ways of what we can do about it today if Newcastle University and other English universities at least are still engaged in renewed forms of taking from the global south to prop up the global north. I would say that it does. I think we're in a moment of a dangerous emboldening of an era and a practice that universities would like to say they've overcome. Hence the many decolonization initiatives that, like those that Luce was talking about, but which international students easily see through, as Mohammed pointed out in those quotes with the students. So for my part, and for my view, what started out as the discovery of a historical donation to the University of the Belgian King, by the Belgian King has become a critical examination of everlasting colonial practices. From the courting of royalty to the courting of international students, universities have been and continue to be a place of social capital. And today, that capital is used to draw in people from around the world. They buy into this notion of a superior Western education without any care of how doing so affects students' experiences during their degrees, or how they come to see themselves whilst in the UK, that is, othered as a resource, as perhaps undeserving of their place at the university, all those things that students shared with us during the focus groups. But there are those who are refusing to let the university off the hook, or they're insisting on holding the university to account. This project is one part of that. We're all trying to make an effort to hold the university to account by pointing out its history, and also where that leads into the present day. Another prime example of this is the movement Newcastle Apartheid Off Campus, who are committed to exposing and challenging the university's links to the genocide in Gaza through its investments in weapons production companies. And there was also last year a postgraduate open day for ethnically minoritized students. This was specifically organized by and for such students and was very explicit in speaking about the shortfalls in race and colonialism, both at Newcastle University, but higher education more broadly. And what's interesting about this is the tensions between the image the university chooses to put out there and what the students' experiences of the university are, as well as their time here. Both present us with differing ways of viewing complicity, but only one challenges us to consider how complicity carries into the present day. I don't really have a full-on conclusion. It's just more, so I think I'm just going to leave it at that and have us kind of question those links between past and present colonialism and what we can take from that. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Samantha and Mohammed, and everyone else speaking. So now I'll give a reflection / summary for I'll try 3 minutes, ask fewer questions than I planned to, and then open up to Q&A. So 2 areas sort of stick out to me as being particularly pertinent in this, and one of them is the memory politics of North East England and the sort of implications this has for belonging in the university context. So, as we've heard, many of the broader links that have facilitated the particular colonial legacies we're looking at of investment emerge from the industrial history of North East England. So the archival work in the project has examined the financial history of the university and shown a complex yet, in some ways a clear web of industrial interests to train workers, to train engineers, shipbuilders, and all other kinds of professions, to generate material wealth and economic growth in the North East region. And that industrial legacy continues through to today, and so do the sort of stories we have around it and we associate with it. Sometimes people think of the economy as just budgets, but to be more specific, in the context we're speaking from, it's predicated on building models of economic growth. And to advance this, you have to attract investment, and investment, particularly in the Northeast. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to build a narrative. And within that, you can see a particular mode of remembering these histories, right? So the Northeast is an industrial heartland. The Northeast has suffered deindustrialization. The Northeast should be allowed to be proud of its history. The Northeast needs economic growth. And the Northeast is the perfect place for your investments because we've got the grit, the will, and the heritage of hard-working industrial labourers to bring it through. And so the spirit of this past of industry is clung to as strongly as it's ever been in this current political moment. But we have to ask, what kind of histories does that allow us to forget, and what kind of histories do we want to forget in the face of that? That's not to say that this is a zero-sum game. There's always been contestations over memory that are, can be generative, but it's also crucial to consider within that the relations of power in those narratives, and who, what allows us to repress certain knowledges and embodied experiences and histories. The other thing that I find striking is the strategic thinking required kind of across disciplines and departments for this work that at its core is pursuing reparative action. So this work has necessitated work from scholars of history, architecture, law, politics, sociology, museum studies, and in the early stages even mathematicians and physicists, right? And in memory studies that doesn't feel like sort of super unusual. Like these disciplines will have some kind of home within memory studies, even if particular disciplines or conventions are more prominent in some areas. But if a historian, a sociologist, and a literary scholar all walk into a bar, you might be at a memory studies conference, right? But what this particular project demands is not just like intellectual cross-pollination, but rather the pursuit of reparative justice. This project, in its multiple phases, requires engagement with multiple areas to enact the kinds of wide-ranging change needed. So this has included multiple areas of university policy, especially around finance and investment, of course, student experience, heritage narratives, PR, the Northeast regional economy, and more. And it's interesting to me that the priorities and philosophies that underpin all these different areas can be different and conflicting and in tension, which sort of begs the question of how far institutional change is possible and in what form, and by addressing which tensions at what levels. So to move on to some questions, I just want to sort of throw out to the panel, if you have any broader reflections on what fundamentally needs to change in terms of the university's approach to remembering parts of its own history, and how do you feel these issues might impact knowledge production? And then after that, I might throw it out to Q&A. So I'll leave that with you.
Thanks, Heather. Shall I start? Would that be sensible? Yeah. Yeah, I think that I was really interested in what you said just there, Heather, about the Northeast and the city sort of memory context there. And because a lot of these kind of themes came through in the workshops that we did, I think, throughout the course of this project. And I think the other context there that I suppose not just Newcastle University, but all the universities are working in, and as well as what Samantha was telling us about the sort of financial crisis of the universities, there's also a kind of a crisis of identity and purpose amongst UK higher education as well. And that's there's lots of reasons why that is the way they have reformed, developed, particularly in the face of kind of financial, the change of the financial model, but also the kind of wider culture and perhaps a bit of a timidity, which has come in as a result of universities being one of the front lines of the UK culture wars as well. So there's a lot of debate about not just the value of university degrees, but particular teaching and research areas, the kind of anti-woke kind of context as well. And this kind of work can often get kind of caught up in that wider context as well. I think that one of the things that has to change is, I suppose, a perception within the institution at all levels that its histories are important and that they are still very much relevant today, and actually shape action and strategy today in very real ways. There's one of the sort of nightmarish qualities of working in universities these days is the chronic short-termism. You literally cannot plan beyond about 9 to 12 months maximum, because you're just waiting on the next influx of students to understand what the financial position will be. And that kind of short-termism has become a chronic, I suppose, a bit of a get-out clause, really, for thinking, so rather than thinking much bigger about the role of institutions in the country, however that's changing, and thinking about a role, an institution like Newcastle and its role in a particular region with a particular history. Instead, we're caught up in this very future focused, but very short term kind of cycle. So that's what I would say there.
I mean, I think what could be interesting with that, as you say, Annie, the short-termism, excuse me, of all of this but connecting that to what Jemima said was, when you get the city involved, when you get the backing from that, I think that is one way. If you can get Newcastle City Council on side, or any of the councils in the Northeast on side, I think they could provide a bit of that stability in a world where politics is ever stable. But you can get a little bit of that stability, but you've also got that sort of a secondary institutional backing, and I think there's room for it there, because we know that in all of this, money is always going to have to be at the base of all of it. It's just simply too hard to do anything symbolically, and by hard also kind of useless, right? But you need, unfortunately, for better or worse, money has to be at the base of anything that you do. But we're never going to have enough of it. We're never going to have enough. And even if you did, how can you make amends for what happened in the Belgian Congo, for example? But I think just kind of starting with who you can partner with, and in this case, as Jemima said, even if that is Newcastle City Council, Durham City Council, or the Greater Northeast with the combined authority, something of the sort.
Yeah, I would say we need a public education. We need to get rid of these massive fees. We need to get a structure in our universities that is actually democratic, where we can discuss things openly, where we can actually go, and I know that's a big picture kind of answer, but I think it's so important to not forget that a lot of what we see right now in the way universities are structured is kind of at the end of putting all these structures in place that are actually not that old. And there are many other places where they are not in place. So it's not hard to imagine what a university could or would look like in a very different structure, where there is actually proper public funding, where taxes go into the education of new generations. that doesn't mean that there cannot be critiques anymore when that happens, or that everything is perfect, but at least there is the possibility to then have the conversation, which I think now is squeezed out in many ways because there is no willingness to have it, because it may affect the market position, or like it may affect the next influx of students being lower or whatever. Yeah, in ways that I don't really understand on their own terms either, because like I would think that a lot of students or prospective students actually would, as I think also both Samantha and Mohammed kind of said, like would appreciate the kind of openness and transparency and kind of a different approach than hiding or kind of pretending it's not important anymore or something. But yeah, it's a big change that needs to happen in some ways. But of course, that doesn't mean that like smaller changes and kind of collaborations are not important as well, because that doesn't, yeah, they can happen in tandem.
Fab, thanks. So I don't know if we can switch to, I don't know if we're in Q&A mode. I think we need to switch to Q&A mode. But yeah, I mean, I suppose while we do that and people sort of collect their thoughts, I don't know if maybe Lucia, Annie, or Jemima, if you want to talk about how we feel the walking tour side of things is going. I know we've had 2 sessions so far, right?
Yeah, so yeah, we had a kind of a pilot walk and then a kind of a fuller walk as well. So I think Lucy's put the link in there, yeah, so you can kind of have a look at the map and resources that were produced around the walk. I think one of the things that's really interesting about it is that it spans pretty much the whole history of the institution, from the 1830s up almost to the present, and has a real spread across the different subjects in the university, everything from fine art to medicine to engineering. So, and it highlights so some kind of it's not just for the institution, but the institution's place in the city, I think is something that really kind of pulls out. For those of you unfamiliar with Newcastle University, the campus is right in the city, and is very porous, as Jemima said. So it's not a kind of closed off space. Citizens of the city will know the campus well and walk through it all the time. So to highlight some of these entanglements in that kind of geographical span, I think has been really helpful. But I'll stop there because I see a question or a hand has been put up, Heather.
Yeah, Jill, I don't know if you can unmute and come on to ask it.
Or maybe pop it in the Q&A as a text, potentially.
Your mic isn't disabled anymore, so you should be able to ask it. Should be able to turn it off.
The wonders of technology.
The micro is working now, so you can ask a question.
Yeah, Jill, I think you should be able to unmute.
I wonder if while we're waiting for Jill there, I wonder, one thing I was really struck, Samantha, by something you said there about how sort of history and sort of being buried in archives, and how that creates a kind of sense of distance and implicit or explicit omission as well, and what are the ways in which we can kind of overcome that, and sort of overcome, as it were, the violence of the archive, not just in this context, but more broadly in other contexts. I think that's a kind of a really interesting point that I was kind of thinking about in relation to this project and some other work I'm doing on rural inequalities. And there are some very interesting new, well, not new, but developing methodologies around this. But it's interesting, I think, that there's something about the power of institutions that you were describing and Mohammed was describing as well, is that kind of pushes against that.
Yeah.
Sorry, there's a question now in the chat. Sorry, guys.
Okay, I'll sort of read it out for the benefit of anyone who can't see it. So besides the campus tour and webpage, are there plans to add physical markers on the site to articulate the links to Leopold and Armstrong? Relatedly, is there a role for artists to work with the project and uni communities to develop forms of commemoration that are nuanced and more than renaming or adding a plaque? Which I think has been the topic of sort of ongoing sort of conversation, actually. I don't know who wants to take that.
I mean, yeah. At the moment, there is a sort of interpretation panel that alludes to the link. Is that the way to say it? It kind of says there is a link, but it's not very explicit, I would say. So yeah, that is one of the things we would like to see change, of course. We have a web page, at least now, where everything is kind of being collated and collected. So that is helpful, because one of the issues we had is that somehow it kept, like, where it was being presented kept changing when we asked it to be publicly on the website. And so every time we put a link to it, that link would disappear. So now we have our own website where we can link to, which is very helpful. I will try to post it in the chat also, if that is useful. Then there is also the link to the report that Annie presented from, so that might be of interest to people. I mean, yeah, I think there is absolutely like scope for a much bigger project to kind of think about all of the things we discussed today, right? And how we can, in a university, make visible and discuss much more publicly what to do with this. It's not up to us necessarily to discuss or to decide what it needs to be, right? It's up to us to kind of create the platform on which we can discuss this and push this forward. There are many more people who, yeah, as we already saw with the international students that were kind of asked, there are many people who have very strong feelings about this, and rightly so, like, of course, understandably so. That is, I think, a first step that needs to be possible to actually have those conversations. Yeah, what forms of commemoration? I think it would be great to have artists involved to kind of think about this as one of the ways, of course, yeah, to make visible and to invite also different reflections. That would be wonderful. Yes. I think Laura also has a question.
Hi, yeah, sorry. And I wasn't here at the very beginning. I've just multiple things going on. So if I ask my question and you think, oh, we covered all of that at the beginning, then please ignore. But I just wondered whether, I mean, I feel like I've been involved in some of these conversations for a while, and I wonder whether we have any sense of, because Newcastle isn't the only place struggling with this, right? This isn't the only place in the UK, probably certainly in lots of other parts of Europe as well, that's struggling with these histories and what you do with them, and what's the appropriate way forward. And I wondered whether, and this is just a genuine question, whether we know of good examples from elsewhere, because and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I remember. So this is just my rant, and then you can answer. Which is when they put up the Martin Luther King statue, I was very frustrated because I felt like it would have been better to spend it on scholarships for Black students than it was to put up a statue, right? So this is a different question, because people talk about taking down statues, but there's also the putting them up. Now, maybe that wasn't the right response. Maybe it's very important to have it there symbolically, maybe. But I remember that was my initial response, was actually, okay, because also it felt like Newcastle was being very self-congratulatory about that, right? Right. It wasn't kind of dealing with anything problematic. It was trying to kind of big itself up through doing that. And so I just wondered whether we have good examples for us from elsewhere where we think they've and I mean they may not be perfect examples because it probably isn't perfect examples, but I just wondered whether anybody had any that we could kind of learn from and adapt. That's just my genuine question.
Hi. I was when I was doing my research, one of the institutions was Leicester University, and obviously as well as Bristol University. I think they've really had like just really, really well. I think in terms of Leicester University, what really helped was the fact that the local community, well, the city council also helped, as obviously was the same with Bristol University. But I find with Leicester University, their historical background. So because of their historical background, they explored the links between jails in Guyana and the links like between colonialism and the university, and then as a sort of reparative action against that, they started working with the University of Guyana and then the Guyana Prison Service to investigate the extent and treatment of mental, neurological, and substance abuse disorders in the jails. And the project was aimed to examine like the historical, social, and cultural perspectives. And I think I think that university, because of their history, their sort of action is no, I don't want to say equal, but it's appropriate, I would say, to like I think sorry. I think in comparison to all the other universities, I would say Leicester and Bristol have probably been from my research, really good examples of where they've examined the historical past and then their actions in response to it has been, if not appropriate, very much, oh my gosh, like this is amazing. Like I can't believe you've been able to do that. A response where, that, and it's still ongoing. So I don't know what they've done this year, but it's not something that's just like how do I say, a performance, or just something they're doing off Black History Month. It's very much a thing of, right, we're going to work through this. And I think that's probably, out of all universities, like even though they're just projects, that's the best approach, because like they understand that this is not just a one-time, one-stop moment. It's like a continuous event. So in my research, I would say Leicester and Bristol University, just off the fact that they've continued to take measures, and their measures are, I would say personally, appropriate measures for achieving reparative justice. So yeah. Sorry, I hope that answers your question. I was really struggling there.
No, thank you. That's amazing, and the Leicester stuff sounds absolutely fascinating. So I really appreciate that answer. That's really, really good. And I to my shame, I didn't know what had happened at Leicester, even though technically that's my hometown. So anyway, so thank you.
If we could very quickly go to Andrew, but also before that, I think the question has come via Samantha into the chat from Jill, which is to ask if the scope of the project would include Ireland or Northern Ireland or even further afield, to contexts sort of built by slave labour. But Andrew, if you want to really quickly come with your question as well.
Sure, thanks so much. Yeah. I'm really excited. Thanks so much for a wonderful presentation today. Actually coming to this talk today from Canada and from Toronto Metropolitan University, which of course actually changed its name among 22 other recommendations due to its former namesake's connections to the Indian residential school system here. And of course, I did have an opportunity to work as a research assistant within that kind of recommendations or recommending process. I was actually really curious. Something struck me in the comments around changing. I think there was a vote put to, if I'm understanding that correctly, a vote put to rename the Armstrong Building at Newcastle, and it was rejected by students. I guess I'm curious about two things. What was the margin of rejection in that? And speaking to sort of the, I guess, the response that, you know, a lot of folks saw this as an attempt to sort of erase or obscure historical connections to that. In a Canadian context, that would be considered a very, at least extremely conservative or even far right position. So I'm wondering how to sort of understand the political coding around that particular response, because it really seemed at odds with sort of the responses as we would understand it here in Canada.
Thank you. Sorry,
yeah, I was going to
Yasmin, go
actually,
ahead.
no, I was going to say, Annie, do you want to go? Because you might have a bit more knowledge of that.
Well, that's a really good question, actually, Andrew, and welcome from Toronto as well. And thank you for dialing in. I think actually it would be brilliant to kind of, and building on Jill's question in the Q&A there about the kind of international comparators that we could be drawing on. I think that's been so helpful. So thank you so much. The vote itself in 2020. So I was just having to look there to see if I could find out what the margin was. I don't know, Luce, do you know what the margin was on the vote for yes or no to change the name? No. But
just
so
know
there
that
was
it was a very low turnout.
Yeah. Yes, it was a kind of a low turnout. There was also a bit of a complication where there was a bit of, I'm not sure if this was in the vote itself or in the background to it, but kind of a debate about if the name was to be changed, what should it be changed to and why? So that also may have had an impact as well. Samantha, do you have any more specifics on that vote? Or
No, I mean, what I was going to say, because I had only just arrived in January, so I was kind of newish to the university myself at the time. I think from the ones that I spoke to, and it feels very anecdotal, unfortunately, I don't have like solid answers, Andrew. It was very much around this idea of, is it performative? I think it's because, of course, in the UK, if you're familiar, the Edward Colston statue had just come down. That felt real compared to changing the name, but then because the Colston statue had come down, there was, as you referenced this, a lot of political conversations about the conservative government at the time wanted it to be sort of retain and explain. That was their thing, put up a plaque, all of these things, whereas the tearing down of the statue was actually quite a lot more radical. And so I think off the back of that, changing the name of the building felt very, very performative. I think from what I had heard, it felt like people had kind of seen through what the university was trying to do. Also because, and this is all sort of anecdotally what I picked up from speaking to people, but it felt that it sounded like, again, a reaction to this, oh no, he sold weapons to the Confederacy, we need to change the name, but he also sold weapons to the Union. And so more than anything, he was just a capitalist. And I think that was kind of what came out of it is yes, he sold to both, he sold to his weapons to a very bad cause, but also we kind of sold them to the other side as well. And so are we changing this? So I think between that combined with seeing it as something very performative, I think just kind of sunk the vote in that direction. But I agree. I agree with what Annie said about it would have been, what do you change it to then? I think that wasn't a conversation that I had heard anything about more specifically.
And just to follow up there, Andrew, just on checking, it was a 78% voted no to change the name at that point.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you have to also put this, to put this in perspective of like who is voting. So this is mostly undergraduate students, mostly not doing a history degree, I would think. So like, understanding of like history changing or name changes in a way that we discuss it. I think I've had these discussions with my students, and it takes a real discussion, right, for people to kind of like grapple with this idea that things can change and that actually matters, and that doesn't necessarily change history, or that it does change history, but in a way that maybe we want. So yeah, I think this is also important to contextualize it.
Great. Thank you so much for providing that. There's so much more that I'd like to ask you about, but maybe I'll just also message individually. Yeah, also, I can't seem to access the chat, so I'm also really trying to find some of those resources that you were sharing earlier. But
Andrew, if you try clicking on Q&A, it should hopefully that will make it accessible, but please do feel free to drop any of us a line and I can send it all to you direct as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for your question and everyone for your responses. I think that's all we have time for. So if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to email any of us. I think our contact details should be on the MSA website somewhere. So yeah, so just to say again, thanks so much to our panelists for putting the work into this and coming together to deliver this sort of really interesting session.
Okay. And thank you, Heather, for putting it together and for chairing it.
Yes, thank you, Heather, and thanks everyone. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.